welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to start our reading of Lilith by George MacDonald. George MacDonald was a Victorian author from Scotland. He was a friend of Lewis Carroll's, and although they never met, he was the inspiration of C.S. Lewis. MacDonald wrote a great many novels in his life and a great many fairy tales, and he also wrote something in between, some fantasy novels for adults, and Lilith is one of those. Chapter 1, The Library. I had just finished my studies at Oxford and was taking a brief holiday from work before assuming definitely the management of the estate. My father died when I was yet a child. My mother followed him within a year, and I was nearly as much alone in the world as a man might find himself. I had made little acquaintance with the history of my ancestors. Almost the only thing I knew concerning them was that a notable number of them had been given to study. I had myself so far inherited the tendency as to devote a good deal of my time, though I confess after a somewhat desultory fashion, to the physical sciences. It was chiefly the wonder they woke that drew me. I was constantly seeing, and on the outlook to see, strange analogies, not only between the facts of different sciences of the same order, or between physical and metaphysical facts, but between physical hypotheses and suggestions glimmering out of the metaphysical dreams into which I was in the habit of falling. I was at the same time much given to a premature indulgence of the impulse to turn hypothesis into theory. Of my mental peculiarities there is no occasion to say more. The house, as well as the family, was of some antiquity, but no description of it is necessary to the understanding of my narrative. It contained a fine library, whose growth began before the invention of printing, and had continued to my own time, greatly influenced, of course, by changes of taste and pursuit. Nothing, surely, can more impress upon a man the transitory nature of possession than his succeeding to an ancient property. Like a moving panorama, mine has passed from before many eyes, and is now slowly flitting from before my own. The library, although duly considered in many alterations of the house and additions to it, had nevertheless, like an encroaching state, absorbed one room after another until it occupied the greater part of the ground floor. Its chief room was large, and the walls of which it were covered with books almost to the ceiling. The rooms into which it overflowed were of various sizes and shapes, and communicated in modes as various, by doors, by open arches, by short passages, by steps up and steps down. In the great room I mainly spent my time, reading books of science, old as well as new, for the history of the human mind in relation to supposed knowledge was what most of all interested me. Ptolemy, Dante, the two Bacons, and Boyle were even more to me than Darwin or Maxwell, as so much nearer the vanished van breaking into the dark of ignorance. In the evening of a gloomy day of August, I was sitting in my usual place, my back to one of the windows, reading. It had rained the greater part of the morning and afternoon, but just as the sun was setting, the clouds parted in front of him, and he shone into the room. I rose and looked out of the window. In the center of the great lawn, the feathering top of the fountain column was filled with his red glory. I turned to resume my seat, when my eye was caught by the same glory on one picture in the room, a portrait in a sort of niche or little shrine sunk for it in the expanse of book-filled shelves. I knew it as the likeness of one of my ancestors, but had never even wondered why it hung there alone, and not in the gallery, or one of the great rooms along with the other family portraits. The direct sunlight brought out the painting wonderfully. For the first time I seemed to see it, and for the first time it seemed to respond to my look. With my eyes full of the light reflected from it, something, I cannot tell what, made me turn and cast a glance to the farther end of the room, when I saw, or seemed to see, a tall figure reaching up a hand to a bookshelf. The next instant, my vision apparently rectified by the comparative dusk, I saw no one, and concluded that my optic nerves had been momentarily affected from within. I resumed my reading, and would doubtless have forgotten the vague, evanescent impression had it not been that, having occasion a moment after to consult a certain volume, I found but a gap in the row where it ought to have stood, and the same instant remembered that just there I had seen, or fancied I saw, the old man in search of a book. I looked all about the spot, but in vain. The next morning, however, there it was, just where I had thought to find it. I knew of no one in the house likely to be interested in such a book. 3 days after that, another and yet odder thing took place. In one of the walls was the low, narrow door of a closet containing some of the oldest and rarest books. It was a very thick door with a projecting frame, and it had been the fancy of some ancestor to cross it with shallow shelves filled with book titles, book backs only. The harmless trick may be excused by the fact that the titles on the sham backs were either humorously original or those of books lost beyond hope of recovery. I had a great liking for the masked door. To complete the illusion of it, some inventive workman apparently had shoved in on the top of one of the rows a part of a volume thin enough to lie between it and the bottom of the next shelf. He had cut away diagonally a considerable portion and fixed the remnant with one of its open corners projecting beyond the book backs. The binding of the mutilated volume was limp vellum, and one could open the corner far enough to see that it was manuscript upon parchment. Happening, as I sat reading, to raise my eyes from the page, my glance fell upon this door, and at once I saw that the book described, if book it may be called, was gone. Angrier than any worth I knew in it justified, I rang the bell, and the butler appeared. When I asked him if he knew what had befallen it, he turned pale and assured me he did not. I could less easily doubt his word than my own eyes, for he had been all his life in the family, and a more faithful servant never lived. He left on me the impression, nevertheless, that he could have said something more. In the afternoon, I was again reading in the library, and coming to a point which demanded reflection, I lowered the book and let my eyes go wandering. The same moment, I saw the back of a slender old man in a long dark coat, shiny from much wear, in the act of disappearing through the masked door into the closet beyond. I darted across the room, found the door shut, pulled it open, looked into the closet, which had no other issue, and seeing nobody, concluded, not without uneasiness, that I had had a recurrence of my former illusion, and sat down again to my reading. Naturally, however, I could not help feeling a little nervous, and presently glancing up to assure myself that I was indeed alone, I started again to my feet and ran to the masked door, for there was the mutilated volume in its place. I laid hold of it and pulled. It was firmly fixed as usual. I was now utterly bewildered. I rang the bell, the butler came, I told him all I had seen, and he told me all he knew. He had hoped, he said, that the old gentleman was going to be forgotten. It was well no one but myself had seen him. He had heard a good deal about him when he first served in the house, but by degrees he had ceased to be mentioned, and he had been very careful not to allude to him. The place was haunted by an old gentleman, was it? I said. He answered that at one time everybody believed it, but the fact that I had never heard of it seemed to imply that the thing had come to an end and was forgotten. I questioned him as to what he had seen of the old gentleman. He had never seen him, he said, although he had been in the house from the day my father was 8 years old. My grandfather would never hear a word on the matter, declaring that whoever alluded to it should be dismissed without a moment's warning. It was nothing but a pretext of the maids, he said, for running into the arms of the men. But old Sir Ralph believed in nothing he could not see or lay hold of. Not one of the maids ever said she had seen the apparition, but a footman had left the place because of it. An ancient woman in the village had told him a legend concerning a Mr. Raven, long-time librarian to that Sir Upward whose portrait hangs there among the books. Sir Upward was a great reader, she said, not of such books only as were wholesome for men to read, but of strange, forbidden, and evil books. And in so doing, Mr. Raven, who was probably the devil himself, encouraged him. Suddenly they both disappeared, and Sir Upward was never after seen or heard of. but Mr. Raven continued to show himself at uncertain intervals in the library. There were some who believed he was not dead, but both he and the old woman held it easier to believe that a dead man might revisit the world he had left than that one who went on living for hundreds of years should be a man at all. He had never heard that Mr. Raven meddled with anything in the house, but he might consider himself privileged in regard to the books. How the old woman had learned so much about him he could not tell, but the description she gave of him corresponded exactly with the figure I had just seen. "I hope it was but a friendly call on the part of the old gentleman," he concluded with a troubled smile. I told him I had no objection to any number of visits from Mr. Raven, but it would be well he should keep to his resolution of saying nothing about him to the servants. Then I asked him if he had ever seen the mutilated volume out of its place. He answered that he never had, and had always thought it a fixture. With that he went to it and gave it a pull. It seemed immovable. Chapter 2. The Mirror. Nothing more happened for some days. I think it was about a week after when what I now have to tell took place. I had often thought of the manuscript fragment and repeatedly tried to discover some way of releasing it, but in vain. I could not find out what held it fast. But I had for some time intended a thorough overhauling of the books in the closet, its atmosphere causing me uneasiness as to their condition. One day the intention suddenly became a resolve, and I was in the act of rising from my chair to make a beginning when I saw the old librarian moving from the door of the closet toward the farther end of the room. I ought rather to say only that I caught sight of something shadowy from which I received the impression of a slight stooping man in a shabby dress coat reaching almost to his knees, the tails of which, disparting a little as he walked, revealed thin legs in black stockings and large feet in wide slipper-like shoes. At once I followed him. I might be following a shadow, but I never doubted that I was following something. He was out of the library into the hall and across to the foot of the great staircase, then up the stairs to the first floor where lay the chief rooms. Past these rooms, I following close, he continued his way through a wide corridor to the foot of a narrower stair leading to a second floor. Up that he also went, and when I reached the top, strange as it may seem, I found myself in a region almost unknown to me. I never had brother or sister to incite to such romps as make children familiar with nook and cranny. I was a mere child when my guardian took me away, and I had never seen the house again until, about a month before, I returned to take possession. Through passage after passage, we came to a door at the bottom of a winding wooden stair, which we ascended. Every step creaked under my foot, but I heard no sound from that of my guide. Somewhere in the middle of the stair I lost sight of him, and from the top of it the shadowy shape was nowhere visible. I could not even imagine I saw him. The place was full of shadows, but he was not one of them. I was in the main garret, with huge beams and rafters over my head, great spaces around me, a door here and there in sight, and long vistas whose gloom was thinned by a few lurking cobwebbed windows and small dusky skylights. I gazed with a strange mingling of awe and pleasure. The wide expanse of the garret was my own, and unexplored. In the middle of it stood an unpainted enclosure of rough planks, the door of which was ajar. Thinking Mr. Raven might be there, I pushed the door and entered. The small chamber was full of light, but such as dwells in deserted places. It had a dull, disconsolate look, as if it found itself of no use and regretted having come. A few rather dim sun rays, marking their track through the cloud of motes that had just been stirred up, fell upon a tall mirror with a dusty face, old-fashioned and rather narrow, in appearance an ordinary glass. It had an ebony frame, on the top of which stood a black eagle with outstretched wings, in his beak a golden chain, from whose end hung a black ball. I had been looking at rather than into the mirror, when suddenly I became aware that it reflected neither the chamber nor my own person. I have an impression of having seen the wall melt away, but what followed is enough to account for any uncertainty. Could I have mistaken for a mirror the glass that protected a wonderful picture? I saw before me a wild country, broken and heathy. Desolate hills of no great height, but somehow of strange appearance, occupied the middle distance. Along the horizon stretched tops of far-off mountain ranges. Nearest me lay a tract of moorland, flat and melancholy. Being short-sighted, I stepped closer to examine the texture of a stone in the immediate foreground, and in the act espied, hopping toward me with solemnity, a large and ancient raven, whose purply back was here and there softened with gray. He seemed looking for worms as he came. Nowise astonished at the appearance of a live creature in the picture, I took another step forward to see him better, stumbled over something, doubtless the frame of the mirror, and stood nose to beak with the bird. I was in open air, on a houseless heath. Chapter 3. The Raven. I turned and looked behind me. All was vague and uncertain, as when one cannot distinguish between fog and field, between cloud and mountainside. One fact only was plain, that I saw nothing I knew. Imagining myself involved in a visual illusion, and that touch would correct sight, I stretched my arms and felt about me, walking in this direction and that, if haply where I could see nothing, I might yet come in contact with something. But my search was vain. Instinctively then, as to the only living thing near me, I turned to the raven, which stood a little way off, regarding me with an expression at once respectful and quizzical. Then the absurdity of seeking counsel from such a one struck me, and I turned again, overwhelmed with bewilderment, not unmingled with fear. Had I wandered into a region where both the material and psychical relations of our world had ceased to hold? Might a man at any moment step beyond the realm of order and become the sport of the lawless? Yet I saw the raven, felt the ground under my feet, and heard a sound as of wind in the lowly plants about me. "How did I get here?" I said, apparently aloud, for the question was immediately answered. "You came through the door," replied an odd, rather harsh voice. I looked behind, then all about me, but saw no human shape. The terror that madness might be at hand laid hold upon me. Must I henceforth place no confidence either in my senses or my consciousness? The same instant I knew it was the raven that had spoken, for he stood looking up at me with an air of waiting. The sun was not shining, yet the bird himself seemed to cast a shadow, and the shadow seemed part of himself. I beg the reader to aid me in the endeavor to make myself intelligible, if here understanding indeed be possible between us. I was in a world, or call it a state of things, an economy of conditions, an idea of existence, so little correspondent with the ways and modes of this world, which we are apt to think the only world, that the best choice I can make of word or phrase is but an adumbration of what I would convey. I begin indeed to fear that I have undertaken an impossibility, undertaken to tell what I cannot tell, because no speech at my command will fit the forms in my mind. Already I have set down statements I would gladly change did I know how to substitute a truer utterance. But as often as I try to fit the reality with nearer words, I find myself in danger of losing the things themselves, and feel like one in process of awaking from a dream, with a thing that seemed familiar gradually yet swiftly changing through a succession of forms until its very nature is no longer recognizable. I bethought me that a bird capable of addressing a man must have the right of a man to a civil answer, perhaps, as a bird, even a greater claim. A tendency to croak caused a certain roughness in his speech, but his voice was not disagreeable, and what he said, although conveying little enlightenment, did not sound rude. "I did not come through any door," I rejoined. "I saw you come through it, saw you with my own ancient eyes," asserted the raven, positively but not disrespectfully. "I never saw any door," I persisted. "Of course not. All the doors you have yet seen, and you haven't seen many, were doors in. Here you came upon a door out. The strange thing to you," he went on thoughtfully, "will be that the more doors you go out of, the farther you get in." "Oblige me by telling me where I am." "That is impossible. You know nothing about whereness. The only way to come to know where you are is to begin to make yourself at home." How am I to begin that where everything is so strange? By doing something. What? Anything, and the sooner you begin the better, for until you are at home you will find it as difficult to get out as it is to get in. I have unfortunately found it too easy to get in. Once out, I shall not try again. You have stumbled in, and may possibly stumble out again. Whether you have got in unfortunately remains to be seen. Do you never go out, sir? When I please I do, but not often or for long. Your world is such a half-baked sort of place. It is at once so childish and so self-satisfied. In fact, it is not sufficiently developed for an old raven, at your service. Am I wrong, then, in presuming that a man is superior to a bird? That is as it may be. We do not waste our intellects in generalizing, but take man or bird as we find him. I think it is now my turn to ask you a question. You have the best of rights, I replied, in the fact that you can do so. Well answered, he rejoined. Tell me, then, who you are, if you happen to know. How should I help knowing? I am myself, and must know. If you know you are yourself, you know you are not somebody else. But do you know that you are yourself? Are you sure you are not your own father, or, excuse me, your own fool? Who are you, pray? I became at once aware that I could give him no notion of who I was. Indeed, who was I? It would be no answer to say I was who. Then I understood that I did not know myself, did not know what I was, had no grounds on which to determine that I was one and not another. As for the name I went by in my own world, I'd forgotten it, and did not care to recall it, for it meant nothing, and what it might be was plainly of no consequence here. I had indeed almost forgotten that there was a custom for everybody to have a name. So I held my peace, and it was my wisdom, for what should I say to a creature such as this raven, who saw through accident into entity? Look at me, he said, and tell me who I am. As he spoke, he turned his back, and instantly I knew him. He was no longer a raven, but a man above the middle height, with a stoop, very thin, and wearing a long black tailcoat. Again he turned, and I saw him as a raven. I have seen you before, sir, I said, feeling foolish rather than surprised. How can you say so from seeing me behind? He rejoined. Did you ever see yourself behind? You have never seen yourself at all. Tell me now, then, who I am. I humbly beg your pardon, I answered. I believe you were once the librarian of our house, but more who I do not know. Why do you beg my pardon? Because I took you for a raven, I said, seeing him before me as plainly a raven as bird or man could look. You did me no wrong, he returned. Calling me a raven or thinking me one, you allowed me existence, which is the sum of what one can demand of his fellow beings. Therefore, in return, I will give you a lesson. No one can say he is himself until first he knows that he is, and then what himself is. In fact, nobody is himself, and himself is nobody. There is more in it than you can see now, but not more than you need to see. You have, I fear, got into this region too soon, but nonetheless you must get to be at home in it. For home, as you may or may not know, is the only place where you can go out and in. There are places you can go into and places you can go out of, but the one place, if you do but find it, where you may go out and in both, is home. He turned to walk away, and again I saw the librarian. He did not appear to have changed, only to have taken up his shadow. I know this seems nonsense, but I cannot help it. And we'll continue with the nonsense next time.